You were awake, and then, you weren't. No transition, no warning, no memory of the moment it happened. 1 second you were lying there, thoughts moving, eyes closed, aware, and then 8 hours had passed and the alarm was going off and the night was simply gone. This happens to you every single night of your life, and you have never once remembered it happening. Scientists have spent decades studying human sleep. They've mapped the stages, they've measured the brain waves. They've tracked the chemical cascades that pull you under. And yet, the one question that sounds the simplest is the one that still doesn't have a clean answer. Why can't you remember falling asleep? Not why you sleep, not what sleep does, but that specific, strange, deeply personal moment when your awareness, your sense of self, the voice in your head narrating your life simply stops. Where does it go? And more unsettling, what is actually happening to your brain in those final moments before consciousness disappears? Because the answer isn't what most people assume. It isn't peaceful, it isn't passive, and in some cases it isn't even sleep. What neuroscience has uncovered in the last decade about those 15 to 20 minutes, the window between wakefulness and unconsciousness, fundamentally changes what it means to be aware. It raises questions about identity, about memory, about what you actually are when the lights go out. And it starts with something that happens inside your skull that you are completely unaware of. If you've ever wondered why that moment disappears, why you can never catch yourself crossing the line, stay with me. Because the explanation is stranger and more revealing about human consciousness than almost anything else in neuroscience. We're going in. And if you're here because questions like this keep you up at night, the ones about what your brain is actually doing, the parts of human experience that don't have clean answers, subscribe now. Because this channel goes exactly where those questions lead. Every time. Understand why you can't remember falling asleep. You first have to understand what memory actually requires. Memory isn't recording. It isn't a camera that runs passively, capturing everything. Memory is a construction process. An active, energy-intensive operation that your brain has to perform deliberately, chemically, structurally, every time it wants to preserve an experience. For a memory to form, several things must happen simultaneously. Your hippocampus, the curved structure buried deep in your temporal lobe, must be actively encoding information. Neurons must be firing in coordinated patterns. Proteins must be synthesized. Synaptic connections must be physically strengthened. And critically, the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for self-awareness and conscious attention, must be online and engaged. Remove any one of those ingredients, and the memory doesn't form. Not a blurry memory, not a partial one, nothing. The experience happens and then simply ceases to exist in your personal record. Now hold that in mind, because here's what's happening to your brain in those final minutes before sleep. It's a controlled demolition, not a shutdown. Not a pause, a systematic, staged deactivation, and the sequence in which your brain powers down its own systems is the key to everything. The process begins before you feel tired, hours before you close your eyes. A chemical called adenosine has been quietly accumulating in your brain since the moment you woke up. Every waking hour, every thought, every conversation, every decision, all of it burns energy, and adenosine is the byproduct. It builds up like exhaust. And as it builds, it binds to receptors that progressively slow neural activity. This is why, by evening, thinking feels heavier, why distractions become harder to resist, why the edges of your focus start to soften. But adenosine is only half the equation. Running in parallel on an entirely separate track is your circadian system. Biological clock running on a 24-hour cycle, governed by a tiny cluster of about 20,000 neurons in your hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This clock doesn't respond to how tired you feel. It responds to light, specifically the wavelength of light hitting your retina as dusk arrives. As darkness comes, the circadian system triggers the pineal gland to release melatonin. Not to make you sleep directly, that's a common misconception. Melatonin is a signal broadcast to your entire body that says, the window is opening. Both systems, adenosine pressure from below, melatonin signal from above, converge at night. And when they do, something begins to happen in a structure most people have never heard of, the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus, a small cluster of inhibitory neurons in the hypothalamus. And when it activates, it begins systematically shutting off the brain's own arousal systems, one by one. The norepinephrine system quieted, the serotonin system dampened, the histamine system suppressed, the orexin system, the one most responsible for keeping you awake and alert, blocked. This is not metaphorical. These are real neurochemical systems being actively inhibited by your own brain in sequence, like a technician powering down a facility for the night. And somewhere in that cascade, you cross the line. But here's what makes the crossing so strange. You don't fall asleep all at once. This is the part that almost no one knows. And it changes everything about how you think about consciousness. Sleep researchers discovered decades ago, through EEG monitoring, through careful measurement of brainwave patterns, that the transition from wakefulness to sleep isn't a switch. It's a gradient. A slow, uneven, deeply weird dismantling of awareness that happens in stages, and that those stages don't all affect your brain the same way. In the first minutes of lying still, as the arousal systems begin to quiet, your brain enters what's called stage N1, the lightest phase of non-REM sleep. And here's where it gets unsettling. During N1, your brain is still partially conscious, not awake but not fully asleep either. You exist in a state that neuroscientists call hypnagogia, a threshold state. a liminal zone between awareness and its absence, and in hypnagogia. Your brain starts doing things that shouldn't be possible in a sleeping mind. It generates hallucinations, not dreams. Those come later in REM sleep. These are something different: fragments, flashes, a face that appears for a half second, a word spoken from nowhere, an image that has no context and no narrative. Sometimes a sound, your name, called clearly by a voice you recognize from a room you're no longer in. Some people experience what researchers call hypnic jerks, that violent, involuntary muscle spasm that jolts you awake just as you're drifting off. The sensation of falling, the snap back to consciousness. That's your brain catching itself mid-shutdown and triggering an alarm. But here's the revelation: most people don't remember any of this, not the hallucinations, not the hypnic jerks they don't fully wake from, not the strange half-thoughts that move through their mind in those minutes, because the very system that would encode those experiences as memory is already going offline. This is the part of the story nobody talks about. Your prefrontal cortex, the seat of self-awareness, of working memory, of the inner narrator that turns your experiences into your life, is one of the first structures to quiet during sleep onset. Not the last, the first. Think about what that means. The system you rely on to notice what's happening to you disappears before you're even unconscious, before your eyes stop moving, before your muscles fully relax, before sleep technically begins. You have already lost the ability to observe yourself. You don't remember falling asleep because by the time sleep arrives, the part of you that would do the remembering is already gone. This is why the experience feels seamless from the inside, why there's no sensation of crossing a threshold, why you can be lying there having thoughts, believing you're still awake, and already be completely unable to form memories of any of it. Sleep researchers have documented people who insist they were awake all night. They describe lying there aware, monitoring the room, tracking the hours. And EEG data shows they were clearly, definitively asleep, cycling through full sleep stages, producing the slow waves of deep sleep for most of the night. They experienced being awake while being asleep, not because they were lying, not because of a trick of memory, but because some component of awareness can persist even as the memory-forming apparatus shuts down. Because you and the part of you that records you are not the same thing, and that distinction is more profound than it sounds. What neuroscientists have pieced together from this research is something that challenges one of the most fundamental assumptions about human consciousness. We tend to think of awareness as binary. You are conscious or you are not, awake or asleep, present or absent. Sleep onset reveals that this is wrong. Consciousness is not a switch, it is a stack. A layered system of processes: perception, attention, self-monitoring, memory encoding, emotional processing, executive function, that can come online and go offline independently, synchronously, in any order at different times at different speeds. What you experience as being awake is actually dozens of distinct neural processes all running simultaneously. And what you experience as falling asleep is those processes decoupling from each other one by one in a sequence determined by your neurochemistry, and the process is not always clean. There is a condition called sleep state misperception, sometimes called paradoxical insomnia, in which people have severe chronic insomnia, but their sleep studies show they are sleeping a normal number of hours. Their brain is sleeping. They are convinced they are not as a psychological disorder. Not as exaggeration, but because the specific systems that generate the felt sense of consciousness remain partially active even during sleep, while the systems that would update them with accurate information are offline. They are experiencing something like awareness. It just isn't tracking reality. Some researchers believe this is not an anomaly. They believe some version of this may be happening to all of us every night to varying degrees, that the experience of lying awake isn't always what it seems. That some of the insomnia people report is actually a perceptual error being generated by a brain that isn't quite synchronized with itself. But this is not even the strangest part. In the last decade, neuroscience has discovered something about the sleeping brain that no one was prepared for. For most of scientific history, sleep was understood as the brain going quiet, a period of reduced activity, rest, recovery, the metabolic equivalent of leaving the computer on standby. In 2013, a team led by researcher Macon Nettergaard at the University of Rochester published a study that fundamentally inverted this understanding. They discovered something called the glymphatic system. Your brain has no lymphatic system, the network of vessels the rest of your body uses to flush out metabolic waste. For decades, neuroscientists didn't know how the brain cleaned itself. The answer, it turns out, had been invisible because it only operates at full capacity in one specific state: deep sleep. During slow-wave sleep, the deepest stages of non-REM, the cells of the brain physically shrink, not slightly, by up to 60% of their volume. This shrinkage opens channels between cells, and cerebrospinal fluid rushes through the brain tissue at speeds that don't occur during waking, washing out the metabolic waste products that accumulated during the day. Among the waste products cleared by this system, beta-amyloid and tau proteins, the precise molecular compounds that build up in the brains of Alzheimer's patients. Your brain doesn't just rest during sleep. It cleans itself, and if the sleep is disrupted, if the deepest stages are cut short or fragmented or chemically altered, the cleaning doesn't happen. The proteins accumulate, night after night, year after year. The connection between poor sleep and neurodegenerative disease isn't correlation, it's mechanism. It's the glymphatic system failing to run its nightly cycle. It's a brain that accumulated the day's debris and never took out the trash. And what controls access to this cleaning cycle, the very process you can't remember, falling asleep. Here's where the picture gets more complicated, because the question of why you can't remember falling asleep isn't just a neuroscience question. It's a question about identity, about what you actually are and what happens to that thing every single night. Philosophers have wrestled with sleep for centuries. Aristotle wrote about it, Descartes used it as a thought experiment, and the problem they kept returning to was this: if you cease to be conscious, what exactly continues? When you fall asleep tonight, the awareness you currently have, the one reading these words, the one carrying your memories and plans and fears, it doesn't dim gradually. It doesn't hand off to something else. It simply stops, and in the morning a consciousness wakes up that has access to your memories, your name, your relationships, your face in the mirror, and immediately seamlessly assumes continuity with the one that went to sleep. But the connection isn't direct. There was a gap, a period of nothing, or something without a witness to report back on what it was. Most people never think about this because sleep feels continuous from the inside. You close your eyes, you open them, time has passed, you have continued, but have you? The neuroscience doesn't answer this question cleanly. What it tells us is that the self is not a persistent object, it's a process, a pattern that runs on neural hardware that can be interrupted, that reconstitutes itself each morning from the raw material of memory and biology, and that the reconstitution is so seamless, so immediate, so automatic, that you never notice the interruption happened. Every morning, you are the latest version of something that stopped and restarted in the dark, and the fact that you can't remember the moment it stopped is not a glitch in the system. It is the system. The brain doesn't accidentally fail to record sleep onset. It deliberately decouples the memory encoding system as one of the first steps of the shutdown sequence, possibly because trying to encode the experience of consciousness dissolving would create a feedback loop the system can't resolve. Possibly because a self that watched itself disappear might not successfully reconstitute in the morning. We don't know. That part remains unsettled science. What we know is that the gap is real, that something happens in it: cleaning, consolidation, reorganization, the flushing of molecular toxins, and that your access to the experience of it has been by design permanently revoked. You will fall asleep tonight. At some point, you won't know exactly when, the prefrontal cortex will begin to quiet. Inner narrator will slow. The open loops of your day, the unfinished thoughts, the lingering anxieties, they'll still be there, misfiring in the dark. But the part of you that notices them will already be gone. Cerebrospinal fluid will move through your brain tissue like a tide. Proteins will be cleared. Memories from the day will be sorted, some strengthened, some quietly discarded. Neural connections will be pruned and reinforced. The brain will do in silence and darkness the work it cannot do while you're using it. And then morning will come, and you will wake up, and you will be you again, or the closest approximation the biology can manage, with no memory of the transition, no record of the maintenance, no access to the hours your brain spent repairing itself from the inside. This has happened thousands of times already in your life. It will happen thousands more. And here's what the science, in its most honest moments, quietly admits: we still don't fully understand what consciousness is. We don't know why awareness feels like something from the inside. We don't know what the gap in sleep actually contains, whether something continues in some form, or whether each morning is, in some precise and literal sense, a beginning. What we know is that the human brain designed a system to become unconscious every night, and then built in a specific deliberate mechanism to ensure you could never watch it happen. Maybe that's protection, maybe that's mercy, or maybe it's the only way the trick works. The night comes for all of us, and by the time it arrives, you'll already be gone.